Why is a small country the size of New Jersey so admired or hated? What is it about Israel, a 75-year-old democracy nestled in the Middle East, shared by many religions and ethnicities, continues to draw everyone's attention? Michael Oren is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He lays out his vision for how Israel can survive and thrive despite its current challenges. Michael, thank you so much for sitting with me today. I know that you have told me to call you Michael, but I feel compelled to call you Ambassador Michael Oren because you have accomplished such incredible things. And so, Ambassador, thank you for this moment.
Great pleasure, Marissa. I can call you Marissa, right?
You can call me Marissa.
Good.
So here we are sitting in Tel Aviv, and I want to share with you a story about where I got my conviction from. People ask me all the time why I run PragerU, where do I get my courage? And the story that I share is that I actually lived here in Israel when I was 13 years old. And as a 13-year-old, they took us to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And I remember walking through those hallways and seeing the luggage and the piles of hairbrushes and the little baby shoes and the images of emaciated people. It was just so horrific for a young tween to see all these things. I could not utter a word. It was very hard for me to see what was done to the Jews in the Holocaust. And I kept walking through the hallways, and as I made it to the end of the hallway, there was a docent standing under a little light by the door. I walked up to the docent, and I said to her what probably most people said to her: how could this happen? How could it go so far where so many people were killed? And she looked back at me and probably said this to 1,000 kids before me. She said, you know, young lady, most people don't fight because they rely on other people to do the fighting for them. And most people don't start fighting until it's too late. And that moment here in Israel had a profound impact on me. It's where I got my conviction because I realized that I can't rely on other people to do the fighting for me, or for my people, or for what's right, or for truth. It lit a fire in me, and is why, for the rest of my life, when I see evil, I fight it. And when I see a task that seems impossible, I do whatever I can in order to solve it. And when I read about your history, and I've been following your work for many, many years, admiring the things that you have done, you are a man of so much conviction. Some of the things that you have done required so much courage. Where does that come from? Where did you get your conviction from?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. And my story is not so different. I grew up in a working class neighborhood, Sicilian neighborhood, where they used to shoot the Sopranos till the neighborhood told them to get out.
Oh, toughen you up.
In the way the Sicilians could. Only Jewish kid in this neighborhood. So I used to get beat up pretty regularly as being a Christ killer. And I come home all bloody, and my father, who was a veteran of World War II, had landed on Normandy Beach, fought all the way through World War II with his brother. The two brothers fought across Europe, had liberated a concentration camp. And they had taken photographs of the horrors they saw there. My father had all these photographs in a little album, and he would open this album and show me the pictures. And by the way, I can show you these pictures. I have them in my cell phone. They're quite gruesome. And he would say to me, you see that, son? See that? That's why we need a strong state of Israel. And it resonated with me. I grew up, I'm a little older, during the period of the Six-Day War. I was a kid. And I saw my parents tearing their hair out, believing that they would witness a second Holocaust in a single generation. Because nobody was going to, Israel was surrounded by Arab armies that were sworn to throw this country into the sea, and nobody was going to lift a finger to help us. And I internalized very profoundly at an early age that we have to defend ourselves. And it was borne out. It's interesting, you mentioned the Holocaust Museum, and contrast the message of the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum in Israel to the Holocaust Memorial in Washington. Why does the Holocaust happen according to the Holocaust Memorial? It happens because of intolerance, it happens because of hatred. And the solution, according to the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, is tolerance, education, getting people to understand each other, to love one another. The Yad Vashem Memorial has a very different narrative. The Holocaust happens because the Jews are powerless. They don't have a state. And the answer to the Holocaust is the Israel Defense Forces. That if anybody dares to try to do this to us again, they're going to have to answer to the IDF. And that's I don't know, I can't speak for you, but that is a message that resonates with me to this day. And I think it very much informs my policy making, my writing throughout. Yes, we are here to take responsibility for ourselves. I define Zionism with one word. It's a one-word synonym, which is responsibility. It's in this country, with all due respect and love for the United States of America, it's only in this country where Jews can take full responsibility for themselves. So a responsibility for for the electricity and the sewers and the defense and the foreign policy. I love that responsibility. And yes, we have to assume it for ourselves because nobody else will do it for us.
I mean, you really took that lesson into your own hands by ultimately going through the journey of becoming an ambassador. And in order to become the ambassador from Israel to the United States, you had to give up your U.S. citizenship.
I did. It was painful. But it was a dream I had since I was 15 years old. When I was 15 years old, I was part of a Zionist youth movement in the United States. And like any good Zionist youth movement, the first trip we did was to Washington, D.C. We get to Washington, and I got to meet Israel's ambassador to the United States, and I shook his hand. And I thought, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be Israel's ambassador to the United States. And the ambassador's name was Yitzhak Rabin, and he later became prime minister. I was later an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin, so I got to work with the guy. But every step along the way, what I studied in college, where I went to college, the skills that I tried to acquire interviewing, I did in order to fulfill that dream of becoming ambassador.
Wow.
And so, yes, I finally got appointed ambassador, but there was a price. And the price was that I had to give up my U.S. citizenship. And it was excruciating. It really was. They call you into the embassy, they put you in front of an American flag, you raise your hand, and they read you your loss of rights. And you say, and you have to say, like in a court of law, I swear that I'm going to give up these rights. And then they take a big stainless steel hole puncher and punch a hole in your passport, like right in the heart of the eagle. Oh. And they give you this passport back. And, it's like being in the army where they take off your epaulets and break your sword. And I tell you honestly, I cried. And I knew the people in the embassy, and they all gave me a big hug. But many people have done this because it's not an illogical request that if you're going to represent one country, you really can't be loyal to two countries.
Right.
But here's the basic fact. They can take away my citizenship, they can put a hole in my passport, but they're not going to make me less of a baseball and football fan.
Right.
And I've written extensively about American history, and I love American history, and I love American foreign policy, and I love what America stood for. And I wouldn't be sitting here with the values I have and whatever convictions you think I have and courage I think I have, unless I had required this through the United States.
Yeah.
And so I, as so many other people here, owe a great debt to that legacy.
What was it like being the ambassador? This was during the Obama years. And if I recall, it was during the time of the Iran nuclear deal.
Just before the negotiations for that. I have an historical perspective. I write a lot about American foreign policy and American policy toward Israel, and I will say, without reservation, this was the most difficult period in U.S.-Israel relationships. We've gone through many ups and downs. We had a tough time with Eisenhower during the Suez Crisis. We had a tough time with Kennedy surrounding the Dimona nuclear reactor. We've had some tough times, but this was a tough time on every day, and it never stopped, and it was on multiple fronts. And I think the keenest front, the most difficult, the most explosive front was the Iran nuclear deal. Because President Obama came into office in January 2009 and made it clear publicly, and as it turned out privately, very clear, that he wanted to reconcile with the Islamic regime of Iran. And this was our primary ally, our principal ally, negotiating with our number one enemy, behind our backs. And not negotiating about anything, but negotiating about an existential threat to the state of Israel, because here you have a regime that is swearing, if not on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis, that their goal is to destroy us. And a country with our history, of at that time 6 million Jews, to have someone getting up there and say, I want to kill 6 million Jews. By the way, while they're denying the Holocaust, they had the annual festival on Holocaust Tomorrow. So they're denying one Holocaust, they want to perpetrate another Holocaust. And here is our ally negotiating with them. And that was extremely difficult.
We're talking about 10 years ago.
10, yes, sir.
Iran is still a problem, possibly even a bigger problem. The whole world is worried about Iran now. What are your thoughts about Iran now?
thought about Iran now is, maybe there's some hope out there that this regime will disappear. I don't think it's going to disappear anytime soon. They have weathered successive attempts to bring it down. Most recently, this women's protest was very admirable, but the regime has at its command hundreds and hundreds of thousands of security personnel. Overthrowing them will be very difficult, as corrupt and miserable as they are. Right now, there's talk about a temporary agreement between the United States and Iran called freeze for freeze, which means that the United States will freeze sanctions and thaw frozen monies. That could be billions of dollars. And Iran would freeze its further enrichment of uranium, but it's freezing at 60%. Now understand that 60% is a couple of weeks, maybe even days from reaching weapons grade of 90%. So basically Iran is going to be paid billions. And we know where this money goes. It doesn't go to building homes and schools in Iran. It goes to building rockets for Hezbollah, rockets for Hamas. They're aimed at us. With that money, and it's going to freeze Iran at a nuclear threshold capacity, which is the ability to make a bomb very quickly. Now, maybe for the United States, that's okay because the United States is, under successive administrations, says that our goal is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Okay. But is the United States ever saying it's going to prevent Iran from getting the ability to make a nuclear weapon very quickly? And they're not. And there's a difference with us. Look what happened in Ukraine. A week after the Russians invaded, Mr. Putin declared a nuclear alert. And guess what the West did? Whoa, we're not giving tanks to those Ukrainians so fast. We're not giving planes to Ukrainians so fast because this guy's liable to push a button. The minute the other side has the ability to threaten nuclear retaliation, the other side's deterrence goes way, way down. And for us, we can have a scenario where Hezbollah, with 150,000 rockets, most of them buried under 200 villages in southern Lebanon, Hamas with thousands of rockets, Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets, Shiite militias in Iraq rockets, Houthi rebels supported by Iran in Yemen with rockets. We're hit by thousands of rockets. And we go to defend ourselves. And we may have to send our army in all different places. But what if Iran says, well, if Israel makes that move, we're going to nuclearize. We're going to get a weapon. And all of a sudden, Israeli policymakers have to stop and think, how much maneuverability do we really have? How much can we, pull this, how much can we stretch this rope? So for us, the achievement of nuclear threshold capacity by the Iranians is a strategic threat, and that they'll be paid for maintaining this strategic threat is a great, great threat to the state of Israel.
But Israel can't afford to just kick the can down the road when it comes to these issues. And so I guess if current administrations would just say, well, we're freezing it, we're slowing it down.
That's what they said.
Israelis can't afford that.
In the Obama years, there were three reasons for making the JCPOA. One was that Iran would become a constructive regional power, quote unquote. Those are the words of the president. That the JCPOA blocked Iran's path to making a nuclear weapon. And the third reason was it kicked the can down the road. Of those three reasons, only one is left. Nobody thinks Iran's going to become a responsible regional power. Nobody in this administration thinks that. They don't think that. Nobody says that the JCPOA or any agreement is going to block Iran's path to the bomb. Secretary Blinken says it will block Iran's path to the bomb temporarily, which is true, temporarily, very temporarily, and only partially. The only reason that's left is to kick the can down the road.
Right.
The only problem with that, at the end of the road is us.
Right.
We're at the end of the road.
Yeah.
And during the course of the road, and I don't want to stretch this metaphor too far, Iran is going to be getting something in the order of $1 trillion.
Wow.
And what are they going to do with that money? We know what they do with that money. It's what they did in 2015.
Right.
So there's no upside for that. And there may be a few Israeli military analysts who say, well, it's good. It'll gain us another 5 years. That's their best estimate for this agreement. Yeah, but it also gives the Iranians 5 years. And they're not going to exactly be, passive either.
Right.
And they'll be developing all sorts of capabilities. The worst one is the development of guided missiles. Mm-hmm. So I had a great privilege of helping to bring Iron Dome to this country. Mm. Iron Dome, wonderful system. It takes out a standoff rocket. It's a rocket that goes up in the air, comes down, and Iron Dome hits it here. Boom.
Right.
You got a rocket that goes like this. When you got a rocket, someone with a joystick can guide it into our airport, into our oil refineries, into Dimona. Right. Our ability to intercept that. We have a system we've developed in the United States. It's called David Sling. It was recently proven in combat. But we don't know what this system how it will operate when confronted not with one or two rockets, but many, perhaps hundreds of rockets. And every interceptor costs about $1 million.
Right.
So there's an economy of scale issue
Right.
here too.
As long as they just make enough, eventually we might not have enough to.
Stuff they're shooting at us costs, $30.
Right.
Really.
It's frightening. It's definitely frightening. By the way, I like to describe Iron Dome to fellow Americans as a shield, because when they think of it as a rocket, they think that it's actually going to attack. But it doesn't attack. It actually just shields. And it's an amazing thing. We're sitting here in Tel Aviv feeling pretty safe because there is essentially a laser shield over us that if a rocket would come in, it will be intercepted by Iron Dome. It's not a rocket that goes and attacks out, but obviously there is a finite number of those rockets that can intercept. And that's really the risk that is.
Well, it's 90% effective, which means every 100 rockets shot at us, 10 get through. It's great to have 90%. Where you're sitting here off my balcony, you got a ringside view of a lot of the rockets that are hit.
Right.
I got some amazing photographs, and it's extraordinary to watch. I see some downsides to Iron Dome that many people don't see. And what it's this is that we have an enemy that knows, certainly in terms of Hamas, knows that they can't destroy us with all the rockets. What they can do is to get us to kill their civilians. That's why they fire these rockets from within civilian areas. They actually want us to kill their people so that then they can claim that we are war criminals. And they can assail us in international forums like The Hague. And their goal is to destroy us not with rockets, but destroy our ability to defend ourselves, the legitimacy of our right to defend ourselves, and ultimately remove our legitimacy as a state to exist. And they're very methodical, very patient. They'll do this war to war to war, chipping away at our legitimacy. They do it great.
Right.
So Iron Dome, in a certain way, is an advantage for them. Why? Because it creates what I call the D word, disproportionality. We're relatively safe on that side. Civilians are being killed on the other side. I have been on, I do a lot of international television, and I've been asked on CNN twice, why doesn't Israel provide Iron Dome to the Palestinians? Like, seriously. And, you've got figures like, John Oliver and talking about the disproportionality. Our response was, what would you like to have? Would you like to have more Israeli killed? Would that make you feel better if more of our civilians are getting killed? So Iron Dome saves Israeli lives, but creates a challenge for us in the field of public diplomacy.
As long as they're willing to use their own people as cannon fodder for their propaganda, essentially.
Well, I mentioned that the 150,000 rockets in southern Lebanon are underground of 200 villages. The family rocket, the rocket's sitting in the living room. The roof opens up. The rocket goes and hits Haifa. Hezbollah, we know, will keep those families in those houses because they want us to kill them for that same reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome to the Middle East.
Wow.
We're in a completely different ballgame here. So these are the challenges we face, which are, I say that our enemy does not have a military strategy. It has a military tactic that serves a media, diplomatic, and ultimately legal strategy. And that is designed to delegitimize us.
Right.
And they do a pretty good job at it. It's pretty hard for
Well,
us.
the media does the same thing in the United States, where supposedly if you're wealthy, if you're successful, then you're immediately bad. And if you are, a victim of some sort, then you must be a victim of those who are successful, right? It's the whole intersectionality thing.
And you have a moral superiority because you're a victim.
Right. It doesn't matter whether you've done the right things in your life or made the right choices or were even productive. That doesn't matter. All that matters is, well, if you're a victim, you must be, on the right side of history.
And that inflection point began in the 60s. And unfortunately for Israel, it began in the late 60s. So just in 1967, when we win this terrific victory over the Arabs, we more than triple the size of the territories under our control. Just at that moment, being a victim became uncool, and became a victim became super cool.
Right.
And we were no longer victims. And one of maybe the greatest achievement of the Zionist movement is that it de-victimized us. And so much so, this may shock you, as a government official, I recoiled from the notion that every foreign visitor comes here, heads of state, is taken immediately to Yad Vashem. Because I don't want to reinforce Jewish victimhood.
Yeah.
I'd rather have them come here and see a kindergarten.
Right.
With kids from around the world, kids from South America, from Ethiopia, from Russia and Ukraine. That, to me, is our victory.
Yeah. It's important for folks who live in Israel for their own national psyche to not see themselves as victims. Like, you see it in the United States of America, they constantly push on Black America that they're victims, that their whole history is all about slavery. I actually had a really interesting conversation with someone about this issue, where if you raise people to think that they're constantly victims, it actually breaks their character down and doesn't give them motivation to be successful, because they're always identifying as victims. And Israelis have managed to do the opposite. They've managed to be the hustlers, the survivors who are focused on actually building and growing. I want to segue into your book, 2048. It was really, it's a short yet very in-depth read. And one of the things that you talk about here is the population living in the center of Israel. And when we were talking about Iron Dome, I assumed that you were going to say that one of the issues with Iron Dome is that it protects maybe a small area. But what about, I don't know if that's also an issue, but I would imagine that it is a national security issue where you have the majority of Israelis living in this area of Tel Aviv and not spread out throughout the country.
It's a strategic danger, it's a social danger, economic challenge, many things. Yeah, eggs in one basket. And here's the basket. We are one of the most densely populated countries in the world because 62% of the country is desert. It's very sparsely populated. We're jammed into the northern, 38% of this country. There's this popular myth/lie that Gaza is the most densely populated area in the world. Tel Aviv is twice as densely populated as Gaza.
Yeah.
And it creates all sorts of difficulties. Israel has 4 times the traffic density that the United States has.
Well, I'm hearing it.
Yeah, here it's not just you try getting anywhere here. You can't make an appointment from A to B at any given time. But that costs the state billions of dollars in work hours. People are not working, they're spending time in traffic jams.
Wow.
So it has all these different ramifications. And yes, if our enemies want to hurt us, they will aim for Tel Aviv.
Right.
We have one major airport, and they aim for the airport. So eggs in one basket. So yes, among the other challenges that the centralization brings is a strategic danger.
The U.S. and Israel are actually facing some similar issues. One of the issues that I read in your book is the issue of sovereignty and lawlessness. So you look at many of the states around America, we have an issue where people can commit serious crimes. California, you can grab $600 worth of merchandise and run out of a store and, get away with it. Lawlessness is a massive issue. I'm hearing from you that it's somewhat similar here in Israel.
I would say it's our cardinal issue in many ways. The Jewish people lack sovereignty for 2,000 years. One day in May 1948, we woke up and found ourselves the proud owner of a sovereign country. And frankly, we didn't understand it. We didn't understand what it means. So I mentioned that 62% of the country is desert. That's south of Beersheba. South of Beersheba, there's no Israeli law, or very little of it.
Why?
Why is it? Because, first of all, there are not enough policemen. And I think that law enforcement is the DNA of sovereignty. Without law enforcement, you really can't have effective sovereignty. So in the South, there are the Bedouin populations. Nobody actually knows how many Bedouin there are. No one will actually take a census here. But there are, as of last counting, this is already a decade ago, 400,000 illegal Bedouin structures in the Negev. Now, if I built a 1-inch addition to my balcony here, I'd have the police and they'd give me a court summons and a fine. You can build an entire city in the Negev. No one's going to do anything because the police will say, listen, we can't do anything. We don't have enough policemen to go in there. You need a brigade to go in there. The Bedouins have polygamy. Polygamy is illegal in the state of Israel, you should know, all right? If I want to take on a second wife, not only whether this wouldn't kill me, but the state of Israel will arrest me. But not if I'm a Bedouin. And 30% of the Bedouin males can have 4 wives. And these are wives that are, it's not like Bedouin man falls in love with third wife. It's Bedouin man acquires third wife. It's kind of chattel slavery.
It's like human trafficking.
In addition to this human trafficking, I'm just talking about the purchases of these wives, which is a type of slavery, and they have very, very big families. And through Israel's child subsidy laws, a Bedouin man can make an awful lot of money just by having a very, very large family.
So they get the Bedouin men.
Oh, sure. We don't discriminate. Welfare. Everyone gets the same welfare.
And the Bedouin are a type of Arab Israeli?
They are Arab Israelis. But what they weren't in the past, and I lived in the South for years, they were not Palestinians, and the Palestinians didn't like the Bedouin. Bedouin didn't like the Palestinians, and they were not Muslims in the sense that of traditional Islam. They had their own very folksy, almost Sufi Islam. So in the subsequent years, they have become Palestinians, and they have become Islamicists. And you go to most of these little settlements, in the illegal settlements in the south, they have a nice green mosque, which is Hamas-type mosque in their vicinity. So we have ignored this situation. We bear much of the responsibility for it, but it has to do with a sort of a hemorrhaging of Israeli sovereignty and an inability to understand what sovereignty means. In these populations, there's no gun control. There's gun ownership rampant, and that's why we have a very high level of murder rate. We have a very low level of murder rate among Israelis generally, but among Arab Israelis it's very high. And drugs rampant, and also human trafficking.
Who are they killing? Are they killing each other?
Killing each other.
It's like gangs, basically.
Gangs and families, which are sometimes interchangeable.
And they're identifying with the Hamas cause. And so is that not becoming a national security issue?
It is a national. You'll see that a growing number of terrorist attacks that are carried out here are carried out by Israeli Bedouin.
Wow.
And that is not surprising to me at all. I'm surprising it hasn't happened more frequently. But during a recent attempt by the police to remove several illegal houses, it sparked huge riots in the Negev.
Right.
And the Bedouin PR came out and saying, hey, this is only the first battle. The next battle is we're going to take over the entire country.
Wow.
And so, in the long run, this is a strategic / existential threat.
Is this a big change? When I served in Israeli intelligence here, we actually had Bedouins serving with us.
Sure.
And so
they
what
can
has
volunteer
happened?
and serve. They can serve, and I serve with Bedouin tractors, certainly. We also did not, we didn't embrace those Bedouin who did serve with us. We didn't provide housing for them. We didn't give them the adequate benefits. And so you have a certain number of Bedouin who, mostly for economic reasons, will join the army. It's a good salary down south. But overall, the Bedouin situation is a grave challenge.
Wow. One of the things you write about in your book that resonated with me is the concept of Israeliness. And I think it somewhat ties to the issue of the Arab Israelis. That you have a country of Arabs, you have a country of Jews. It's a Jewish state, but you have people of multiple different sects, and even within Judaism, there's the Haredi, which is the more religious Jews, and there seems to not be a unifying Israeliness here. And I think it's something that we're seeing in the United States as well, where Americanness is disappearing. Our education system is not teaching core knowledge. It's not teaching the concept of patriotism. Actually, patriotism has become a pejorative in many American schools. And so we're seeing a fractured society. And you're seeing this here in Israel as well. Can you describe that to me?
It's good news and bad news. Well, let's give the bad news first. Okay. You're right. We are a fractured society. Our former enemies, the Arab countries, had the goal to make peace with us. These people. I'll never forgive them for making peace with us, because that was an external pressure that kept Israel together. All of a sudden, peace, 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 and all the divisions with Israeli society are coming to the surface. So yes, you have Arab and Jew, you have religious and secular, left and right, Tel Aviv versus the rest of the country, center and periphery, and you have Mizrahi, Jews from North African and Middle Eastern backgrounds, versus Ashkenazis, Jews from the West. Very deep divisions. But the deepest division we have, and one that is coming to the fore right now, out in the streets of Israel, literally, as we're speaking, is the division between what I call the normal and abnormal Israelis. So one of the great visions of the founders of Zionism, some of them, was that Israel, the future Jewish state, would be a normal state. We'd be a state like, Ireland is Irish. And the normal state would be a state that, we speak Hebrew, we have Jewish holidays, Jewish calendar, but we have great beaches and great nightclubs and wonderful food and art and music and equal rights for minorities and democratic rule. All these issues were basically Jewish Sweden with good beaches, the lager, and probably better food. Then there's the abnormal Israelis. And that's the Israelis basically of my neighborhood, which is in South Tel Aviv. And I hear it even from the people in my building here, is that 4,000 years ago, God came to Abraham and said, guess what? You're not going to be normal. You're not going to do what anybody else does. And for 4,000 years, the Jews have been abnormal. That's our distinction, the true distinction, that we are not like everybody else. And why these people say, after 2,000 years of exile, we come back and get a Jewish state. Why do we want that Jewish state to be normal? We want it to be a Jewish state. We don't want to be a normal state. And you could break it down and say it's democratic state versus, Jewish state, but it doesn't quite work that way. And because some people on the abnormal side want to be democratic, a lot of people on the normal side want to be Jewish. But that is a fundamental schism here, a tension in this country. So that's the bad news. And these schisms have come to the fore now that these Arab states have had the gall to make peace with us. The good news is that Israeliness and Israeli modernity is very difficult to intercept. It seeps in. How does it seep in? When I moved here a long time ago, I moved here 45 years ago, if you went to the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods of Jerusalem, everybody was speaking Yiddish. Now they speak colloquial Hebrew, but colloquial Hebrew. And that would be unthinkable that 45 years ago. Yes, we have a divide between Ashkenazis and Mizrahi Jews, but a huge segment of the population is what you call intermarried. People who come, from both traditions. And they think of themselves as Israeli today. They don't think of themselves as primarily Mizrahi or primarily Ashkenazi. Israeli Arabs. Israeli Arabs that I can't adduce any sort of concrete evidence to support this, but I've heard this again and again, that their Arabic is becoming unintelligible to other Arabs because they have so much Hebrew in it. I hear it in the street because we're in a mixed neighborhood here, and I hear their Hebrew. And I hear their Arabic, and it's mixed in with a lot of Hebrew.
Wow.
So there are elements of Israeliness that have seeped in. Without mentioning names, I took a prominent American Republican leader to dinner last night in Jaffa. Jaffa's down the road. We went to a restaurant. I would say a third to half of all the patrons were Arab women wearing hijabs.
Wow.
And we're sitting in the same restaurant, enjoying the same food. It's a kosher food. And, let's sing a lot.
How big is the Arab population?
So the Arab population is 21%. The Arabic speaking, okay? Some of the people are Arabic speaking, but not Arabs. But the Arab population is 21%. And that's the reason in this book in 2048, rather uniquely, the beginning is in English. You turn it around, it's in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Right? But in the middle, it's in Arabic.
Oh, that explains why it's such a fast read.
It's a fast read. We'll try in Arabic, a little slower. But I think that in itself is a statement because I write about Arab Israelis and how to include them in our country and finding a place for them in our story because we are a story.
Right.
And we have found a place for Ethiopian Jews. We found a place for Druze, who are Arabic-speaking non-Arabs. They have their own religion. For Circassians, who are Arabic-speaking Muslims but not Arabs. We found place for them in our narrative. And we have to find a place for Israeli Arabs in that narrative too and bring them on. I talk in the book in a chapter which I think only Americans will truly appreciate. Unfortunately, I talk about the New Deal, which has a resonance for the Americans, of course, but Israelis don't necessarily understand that. But the New Deal is this, that Israel must fight discrimination. And certainly I grew up during the civil rights movement. I know what it is to fight discrimination. We fight it in a sort of Churchillian sense. You fight it in the classroom and in the courtroom and culture in the university. Everywhere you fight this. And we just don't say we stand for equal rights. We actually effect equal rights for Arab Israelis. But Arab Israelis will express their loyalty to a nation state of which they are not a part of that nation. They are a loyal minority in a nation state. And there are dozens and dozens of examples of this in the world. Most nations in the world are nation states, and they have non-national minorities. And the best example I always give is the Jews of Great Britain, who salute a flag that has not one but 3 crosses on it. And they sing a national anthem to the head of the Church of England. And they're willing to fight for that flag. Many of them died for that flag. Yeah. Why can't an Arab Israeli salute the flag that has the Shield of David on it?
Right.
Really, by the same token. And so that's the New Deal. And the good news is, for a certain segment of that Arab population, that's happening. They do polls every year. The number of Arab Israelis who are proud to be Israeli. And the last few years, finally, it has tipped the 50%, Tom, which is interesting. And earlier in this century, during what was called the Second Intifada, Arab Israelis protested against the presence of police in their towns and villages. Now they're protesting the absence of Israeli police in their towns and villages. They want the Israeli police there. And that's, to me, very significant.
Yeah, it begs for really an honest question, and that is, are Israelis willing to accept the Arab Israelis and integrate them? And are the Arabs willing to accept that this is a Jewish state? And you're saying about
we're not there yet. We are not there yet. But the polls indicate yes. And so, many secular Israelis and this is going to say something, brace yourself, would rather have an Arab neighbor than have an ultra-Orthodox Haredi neighbor.
Yes, I've actually noticed that. I think that's true.
They don't see, the Arab is not going to interfere with their lifestyle, and we can live and let live. That is the case where I'm living here in Jaffa, which is a mixed city, and we have Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And it's not without its tensions. So we had riots in May of 21 here in certain segments of Jaffa, not all segments of Jaffa. So there are tensions here. Certainly there are tensions, but they could be much worse. Let us not forget that where we're sitting here, Marissa, we are about a 7-hour drive from Baghdad.
Yes.
We're about a 6-hour drive from Damascus, 7-hour drive from Cairo, an hour and a half drive from Gaza. The fact that you can go to a restaurant like I did last night and sit around all these people who are wearing hijabs and some are wearing kippot, that's no small thing.
Right. And many of the Arab Israelis that I have met here would rather live here than anywhere else in the Middle East. At least when I ask them, would you want to move to Baghdad? Would you want to move to Cairo? They say no. They love living here.
No, to say that there's inequality in many ways, or discrimination. We're a nation of human beings, and human beings have their biases, particularly in the Middle East. And we should never say to the Arabs, "Hey, you don't like it here, go live in another country. You have it better here." That's not an excuse for any type of inequality that lives here. We should be fighting it. Again, we should be actively combating discrimination. But appreciation also that even in the face of a conflict that has continued for 75 years and often becomes a hot conflict, that we have the level of coexistence that we had. I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but for about a year and a half, when I was the deputy in the Prime Minister's office in the Knesset, I was given charge of the Palestinian issue, Judea and Samaria and Gaza. You don't wish this on anybody. No. I think I learned more in that year and a half than I learned in 20 years of university. And you realize how deeply, deeply complex it is. Just take Gaza for a small example. The Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is willing to fight Hamas to the last Israeli.
Yeah.
Iran is willing to fight Israel to the last Palestinian.
Right.
Hamas loves humanitarian disaster, so it can blame Israel for humanitarian disasters. I mean, you go nuts doing this, just following this. But here's the extraordinary thing. With all this, every day, 170,000 Palestinians from Judea and Samaria come into Israel to work. They pass through 37 checkpoints. In 35 of them, they wait 5 minutes to get into it. And that's it. There's 2 of them that are problematic in Jerusalem because the Palestinian Authority wants them to be problematic, but that's another story. 17,000 workers come out of Gaza. This is an area that's shooting at us. It's a war with us. And that's extraordinary level of coexistence. And these are Palestinians who come into Israel, who speak Hebrew, who interact with us on a daily basis. See up front, I hope in most cases, that we're not monsters. Right. And they go home.
Right.
And so people who talk about divorcing us from the Palestinians, I think have it exactly backward. We have an interest, both of us, in having more interaction. Right. Certainly peaceful and economically beneficial interaction.
Yeah, you talk about coexistence, but it's actually almost codependence.
It's not almost.
It is. It is.
I mean, Palestinian labor makes up for a big chunk of our labor force of many jobs that Israeli Jews don't necessarily want to have.
Sure.
But you go to any of the malls, certainly in the eastern part of the country, everyone's going to be serving is going to be Palestinian.
Right.
And
how does education play into this factor? So one of the things that you write about is that education in Israel is on the decline, which is not that different from the United States. Y'all are down to 39 in the world. And so that's one element, just the academic education, but then even just the cultural literacy. Are Israelis learning somewhat a similar curriculum so that they have a mutual conversation? You're saying they're all starting to speak.
The hardest question. This is the education one of the hardest questions.
It's very hard because they're all speaking Hebrew. You're saying there are Israelis that are speaking Hebrew, the Arab Israelis are speaking Hebrew, the Haredi Israelis speaking Hebrew, but are they actually speaking the same language? Do they actually have cultural literacy? Do they have common fibers? This is the issue in America. We all speak English, but we're starting to speak a different type of English, because we don't understand each other. We don't have cultural literacy anymore. Is this what Israel is showing us, that this is deeply problematic when you don't have cultural literacy? And how does the education play into this?
Now, there are all sorts of reasons for the decline in Israeli education. Some of them are purely demographic. We have the highest natural increase rate of any industrialized country in the world, by far, by far. You need 4.4 kids in the family to have a positive growth rate. I was the 0.4 kid in my family, so I know. We have kids falling out of the trees here.
Yeah. It's the opposite for us, by the way. We're at 1.7 in the U.S.
You're going down, I know. You're below replacement rate. The Israeli model is Israeli boy meets Israeli girl. They get married before they figure out how they can afford these kids.
That's
or their
great.
Careers, they have 3 kids, and then they figure it out. It's just
There's
the
something
opposite.
for us to learn from
This
you
is
all.
my kids, by the way. I got a lot of grandchildren. They're wonderful. So we have the population explosion is so fast, so rapid that the education system can't keep up with it. So you have more and more kids per classroom, and teachers are not paid that much. And they're overworked and underpaid, and it's not a profession that a lot of Israelis want to go into. You have to be very, very dedicated to education. And so that has been declining very fast. Now, still, Israelis per capita are the most educated population in the world. We have more PhDs, more MAs. It's great. But the actual level of the education is going down. And that is reinforced by the fragmentation of the education system. We have 4, at least, separate education systems.
Wow.
And yes, in one of them, which is the national secular education system, they're getting that Israeliness. They have a strong emphasis on civics and democracy. But there is a Arab education system, and there is a Haredi ultra-Orthodox education system. And particularly in the Haredi system, not only are they not getting civics, they're not getting mathematics, and they're not getting English, anything beyond a second grade level. And that means when these young Haredi men and women become 18, it is almost impossible to integrate into an advanced economy. And that is a acute problem today, but by 2048, 25 years from now, almost a half of all of our elementary schools' children will be ultra-Orthodox, Jewish.
Right.
That means the state financially, economically, will not be sustainable.
Wow.
Forget about defensible, because they're not going in the army, but they also won't be able to go into the economy. So the breakdown, the absence of sovereignty over that school of education, the Haredi school of education, is something akin to a strategic / existential threat. You also have national religious education, which is many of the people who are in the settlements have that education, which is highly Zionist, also has civics, heavy on the sciences, very good education system, but they're different. All these curricula are different.
Wow.
And the Arab curricula is not necessarily stressing Zionist history.
Israel is known as startup nation, right? Innovations are coming out of here. Do you think that given what is happening here on the education side, will Israel be able to maintain that?
Israel maintain it because, we have the Jewish mind, which is very innovative. What can I say? We're around for 4,000 years because we innovated. We came up with this really great notion of one God once upon a time. Remember that one? We were innovating all the time. So it's a national characteristic. This country has more Nobel Prize winners than it has Olympic medal winners, for example, right? Poor guy who comes home and says, "Look, Mom, I want a gold medal." She says, "No, so where's your Nobel Prize?" Big deal. Prime Minister Netanyahu used to always say to me, "Yeah, our education level's going down, and the Finns are number 1, but we are number 1 in innovation, and the Finns are way down there. And you don't necessarily have to have great math education to be innovative."
Right.
I'm concerned about this. We have one immense advantage that you don't have in the United States, and virtually no other country has, and that is universal conscription. So the 18-year-old kid who's whiz in computers, the Army knows from the time she's 12, 13 years old that she's the whiz kid, and they're going to fast track her into intelligence. And I have friends who are, these great entrepreneurs. They tell me that they will not hire anybody who comes out of a computer science course and a university. Why? Because the universities are 8 years behind the Army. So we get this whiz kid for at least 3-4 years. And then they come out of that and they invent Waze, they invent Mobileye, they invent all these extraordinary, game-changing, disruptive technologies. That same whiz kid in the United States is not going into the U.S. military. That whiz kid's going to Stanford, and when they go to Stanford, they're going to go to Silicon Valley and make a lot of money. They're not going to the military. And they're not developing the skills you'd get in the military framework. So it's a huge advantage we have. The downside to all this, listen to this is also in the book, is that the great emphasis now on technology in the military is widening our social gap. I say this without any pride. The gap between rich and poor in this country is only exceeded by that of the gap between rich and poor in the United States of America and Mexico and Chile. We have 1 million kids beneath the poverty line here. We don't see that Israel.
Right.
And much of that Israel is, yes, Bedouin and ultra-Orthodox, but still, a big social gap. The emphasis on technology tends to make that gap wider. Why? First, because people are making an awful lot of money on innovation. That's great. And our per capita GDP has now passed that of Japan, Italy, New Zealand, Austria. We're closing on Germany here.
Wow.
Per capita GDP. But again, a huge section of the population is beneath the poverty line because of the gap.
Yeah.
So why does the Army widen the gap? Because if you are living in a nice northern Tel Aviv neighborhood and you have kids, you're going to give your kids coding lessons when they're in 3rd grade. I know, because my grandkids are getting coding lessons in 3rd grade. And that is going to fast track you into the military intelligence units. Once you're in the military intelligence, you come out of those units, you're
set.
You're set. You're going to be gobbled up by Microsoft. You're going to be gobbled up by these guys. Increasingly, the soldiers who are guarding our border, who are lying in ambush every night in the rain and the snow and the mud, are people coming from the poorer sections of society. Sounds familiar, America? And they come out and they know how to fire a gun.
Right.
Right? So the solution that I provide solutions, I don't identify problems, is that we have to offer very intensive technological courses for the people coming out of these, the grunts. I'm speaking as a former grunt.
Right.
And who can't code. So that we have to be very cognizant of the fact that one of the factors that increases this gap of the social gap is a gap in education. And so education has ramifications all over the place.
Yeah, education got us into this mess. Only education can get us out.
Of this mess.
That's what we always say at PragerU. Can you explain to me this judicial reform conflict? And is this as severe as the media makes it out to be? It feels like Israel is just going down fast, if you believe what the media has to say.
It's severe, but not as severe as the media makes it out to be. I'll explain in a second. Again, going back to the book 2048, I wrote this book 3-4 years ago, and there's a chapter there on the need to reform Israel's Supreme Court.
So not a new thing.
Not a new thing at all. Back even then, the current heads of the opposition understood that the present situation, the status quo, is not sustainable. Why? You are a citizen of the United States. One of us is, right? And you have not one, but 2 opportunities to influence the composition of the Supreme Court. You vote for the president, you vote for the Senate. Israelis, we have next to none. And which is why the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court is a major electoral issue in the United States, but Israel's not at all, because no one asks us. Supreme Court judges are chosen by a committee of 9. On that committee, there are 2 ministers, 2 members of Knesset, but 5 jurists. 3 of them are sitting jurists on the Supreme Court. So if you had, Justice Sotomayor choosing a replacement, she's obviously going to choose someone who agrees with her, not someone who disagrees with her. And the opposite would be for, Kavanaugh. Okay? But in the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court judges basically are choosing their successors.
Wow.
Which means in terms of its worldview, our Supreme Court is marching in place circa 1992. But the Knesset has moved. It's moved significantly rightward. And so the distance in worldview has grown wider and wider. And increasingly, the Supreme Court was overturning pieces of legislation from the Knesset. And people at Knesset were saying, well, who elected you? We're elected. We're the sovereigns. You're not the sovereigns.
Sure.
And they started talking about, in the Knesset, about an override law, which says that if the Supreme Court overrules a piece of legislation, okay, then the Knesset can vote by a certain majority, and the smallest majority would be 61, which is the smallest majority you can have. They'll overrule the Supreme Court. That is pretty much the end of what we call judicial review, which is where it gives the Supreme Court the final word. And that's the pillar of most democracies in the United States, including American democracy. And I was very concerned about it. So I suggested ways that we could reform the Supreme Court in a way that preserves judicial review. We had to give the people a say in the election, a much bigger say in the elections. We had to limit the scope of the Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court arrogates to itself the largest scope of any Supreme Court in the world under the notion that everything can be judged. Everything is adjudicable, including the position of this cup on this table, which is crazy. We also don't have a constitution. I don't think we're going to have a constitution. I don't think America can get a constitution today and, get people in Philadelphia to agree on a constitution today. We're too diverse. So the Supreme Court makes rulings on the basis of reasonableness. What's reasonable, what isn't. which is highly subjective, alas.
Totally subjective.
So we had a situation, for example, there was a minister who was elected by the name of Aryeh Deri from a religious party. And the Supreme Court, he had been twice convicted of fraud and bribery, had gone to prison for a while. And the Supreme Court ruled by a majority of 10 out of 11 that it was extremely unreasonable that Aryeh Deri serve as a minister. Okay. But 400,000 people voted for Aryeh Deri and didn't think it was unreasonable. So, where is the balance here?
Right.
It's very, very difficult. So there are ways that we can reform this. My personal opinion was that the government had the right idea that we needed reform. It just went too far. It removed judicial review. It said a number of things. It said, first of all, that you could have the override of 61 members. It said that every member of the Supreme Court would be appointed by the government, which is very difficult here because we need more diversity, even more than you have in the United States. We need an Arab judge. We need maybe a Haredi judge. And that it would do away with reasonableness entirely, which is very difficult to do really any ruling, rather than just limiting unreasonableness and reasonableness. They did away with it. And then finally, in order for the High Court to override a piece of legislation, the Knesset, they have to have a majority of 14 out of 15 judges, which is never going to happen. So it's basically no judicial review. That's what's bringing people out to the street. Though there were 700,000 people came out originally, that number has now dwindled to about 150, okay? Why the big drastic reduction is because a number of people who were protesting against the reforms were not protesting to bring down the government, that they're willing to accept the outcome of the government. They're willing to see the government as legitimate, even though they may hate Benjamin Netanyahu and the people in his government. Still, they understand, hey, there's an election, we have democracy. That's the price of democracy. Sometimes you get governments you don't like. Sometimes. But there's a chunk of people out there, including some of the organizers of these demonstrations, that's not what this is about. It's about bringing down the government and not accepting the outcome of the elections. So this is what I call the Americanization of Israeli politics. And I've met with now one of the heads of one of the organizers of the demonstrations. Just what he said to me: "We're taking off the mask." So it gets even more complicated, and it's this. Again, remember, we're in South Tel Aviv here, and maybe there are 700,000 people out there protesting, but there are 9.3 million people not protesting, and their voices never get heard. So if you go out across the street and ask people what these demonstrations are about, they'll say it's not about freedom. It's not about democracy. These demonstrations are about power. They're about, put it in American terms, they're about white power. Okay? The majority of Israeli Jews are from Eastern background, Mizrahim. Of the judges on the Supreme Court, 14 out of the 15 are Ashkenazi and not a part of that majority, Mizrahi majority. And what people in this neighborhood, and this is a conservative, largely Mizrahi working class neighborhood, will say that the protests are actually about refusing to accept the outcome of the elections in which that class lost. And so the Ashkenazi elite is rallying around the last bastion of Ashkenazi elitist power, which is the Supreme Court.
Wow.
That's a very powerful argument. And so you see that there are all sorts of aspects of this that are not very much understood by the American public, that are social, they're ethnic, they're racial, class aspects. And it gets complicated.
So the vast majority of Israelis are not represented by what we're hearing in the media then. Because in the media, what I'm trying to listen in on what's happening in Israel, they are saying that Bibi Netanyahu, who was elected democratically, is supposed to go to jail. And he has done all these terrible things. And that is why he's trying to demand judicial reform in order to protect himself from going to jail. And as long as he gets to remain prime minister, then he can't go to jail. But the way to save his crownship is by enacting this judicial reform so that he can put his own people on the court.
That's like 4 or 5 bridges too far. I'm actually unconvinced why a judicial reform would keep Benjamin Netanyahu out of jail. And by the way, he's innocent until proven guilty. And I've been following the charges against him since day one, and most of them would never even make an American courtroom. So I don't know what that outcome would be. I think, yes, he has an interest in going to court as prime minister and not as a citizen, because the prime minister does have certain protections that a normal citizen and an average citizen doesn't have. And we see how that plays out in the United States with presidents and former presidents. But I think that the reforms reflect a long-standing, deep-seated disaffection of large segments of the Israeli public with the Supreme Court. It's out of step, ideologically, ethnically, in many ways. Many Israelis felt that there was, in this dual personality we have of democratic and Jewish state, too much emphasis was put on the democratic and not on the Jewish. And certainly very strong feelings within the Israeli right that the Supreme Court is a bastion of leftist power. And there are significant elements in the Likud. I've just come off commenting on Israeli television about a interview that Netanyahu gave to the Wall Street Journal last night, where he said he's backing down from some of these reforms. And now there's a brouhaha within the Likud. They're angry at him. They don't want him to back down. When I talk to young Likudniks, and they feel very ardently about the need for this type of reform.
If a reasonable Israeli would say that judicial reform is fair,
yes,
why are they protesting in the way that they're protesting? Is it really just about not accepting the results of the election? Is that at the end of the day what this is about?
I would say hardcore of the protesters, yes. And that they tell me. These are people who've been protesting against Netanyahu for a long time. And it's not just against Netanyahu, it's his government. And there are, for a large segment of the Israeli population, there are members of this government who are extremely problematic and, in fact, racist. And Israelis will see, again, this government is giving a lot of money to the Haredi education system and perpetuating a situation which in the long run could take down the entire country. So they see that as almost kind of suicidal. A government that is now allied with the most radical elements in Israeli society on the Israeli right. And that is very problematic. It is.
Yeah, so on the left side, they were saying, well, at least let us hold on to the justices in order to control, right.
They're right, and that you do need checks on government. You know, America, you're lucky. You have 3 branches of government, co-equal branches of government. We only have 2. Because the government here and the Knesset and the legislature are the same. It's as if the President of the United States and every member of the cabinet would be an active member of Congress. So when Benjamin Netanyahu goes into Knesset, he's not referred to as Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's referred to as Knesset member Netanyahu, okay? Member of Knesset. So it's the only check we have on government is the judiciary. And if you weaken the judiciary, you have no checks.
And that's why they're so upset.
That's what they're sad. They're afraid that and I'm not making this up, ultra-Orthodox parties in the Knesset actually proposed that there be no electricity on the Jewish Sabbath for all of Israelis, okay? They proposed that if someone to go to the Western Wall dressed in immodest clothing, they could go to jail for 6 months.
Wow.
Now, if there's no Supreme Court there to stop this legislation, what check is there?
Right.
Now, you can say, some people in the Likud will say, well, the government itself is a check. But will it always be a check? And, the Supreme Court is not about preserving the prerogatives of majorities. It's about preserving the rights of minorities very often. And that is a benchmark of any democracy in the world. And I certainly want Israel to be in the league of liberal democracies.
I'd say, if I may ask the obvious question, is why not sit down and negotiate? It sounds like there are 2 extremes. Can't Bibi Netanyahu come down and sit with both sides and say, okay,
but he is.
We need judicial reform.
Yes.
It may not go as far as what the extremist would want, but let's create judicial reform where it's fair. Some of your ideas on judicial reform might be implemented. Why not get to that point? Why are we getting to a point where we're seeing the country of Israel, protesting every week, reporting that businesses are going to get their investments out of this country. Why are they allowing this to get out of hand? It feels like it's just getting out of hand.
It feels like it's getting out of hand. I mean, one reason is purely political in the sense that Netanyahu is not the Netanyahu we knew from years before. He was very strong. He's very weak. He always wants to be in the middle of his coalition. He wants to have parties to the right of him, parties to the left of him. Now he is the leftmost person in his own coalition. And every member in his coalition basically has a gun to his head. If you don't do what I do, I'm going to bring it down. I had a professor many years ago named Asher Aryan. He was the first great professor of Israeli politics, a former American. And I once asked him, if you had to teach me one rule about Israeli politics, what would it be? And without hesitation, he said to me, Israeli politicians always prefer collective to individual suicide.
Take the whole thing down.
Take the whole thing down. If I don't get my way, the whole thing's going to go down. So why you're in these negotiations now. And Netanyahu, to his credit, has agreed to negotiations under the aegis of our president, President Herzog. And each side is blaming the other side. They're not willing to compromise. But in fact, if you look at what interest do the opposition parties have in making a compromise right now? As long as this struggle goes on, Benny Gantz, for example, the leader of the largest opposition party, his numbers keep on going up. And Bibi's numbers keep on going down. Why should he make a compromise and bail this out? Even though it's great for the country, it's better for me. So I prefer the collective suicide.
Wow.
Bring the whole thing down. It's like a Samson complex. For Netanyahu, he's in a very rough spot because on one hand, the administration says they're not inviting him to the White House because of the reforms. And they're threatening to close the airport. And their reservists are saying they're not going to serve in the army. And it is tearing at a lot of the fabrics of Israeli society. But he wants to compromise, like he did in this recent interview in the Wall Street Journal. His own party is going to have a very difficult time with him.
You talk about problems, right? This judicial reform sucking up so much the political energy in Israel. And I'm coming from the United States. And I'm seeing that there are bigger problems for Israel and for the world. Let's take China, for example. Israel's so focused on this judicial reform. Are they focused on what's happening in China?
No. In a short, no.
Do you agree with me that maybe
Yes.
it takes an outsider to come here and say, hey, Israelis, you have bigger fish to fry. Let's converse about China. Let's come together to deal with one of the biggest existential threats to the West, to the U.S., and probably to Israel as well. Let's talk about China. Let's get people to focus on what actually
matters. I'm sitting with one of the heads
matters.
of the Mossad a couple of years ago, and he says, everyone's talking about Iran here, everyone's talking about Hamas and Hezbollah. The thing that keeps me awake at night is China.
Yeah.
And he showed me a map. He showed me a map of the 35 ports that China has acquired around the world, sometimes by lending money to poor governments and then waiting for them to default and then taking over the ports that they built. China now controls the entrance to the Red Sea. They have the largest military base in Djibouti at the entrance to the Red Sea. They are reported to be planning to build 2 new ports on the Persian Gulf. If I were a betting man, I think China will be involved in rebuilding Syria in the next couple of years. The price tag for building Syria is something around $300 billion. The Russians can't do it. The Iranians can't do it. The Chinese can do it. We have China to the north of us. And the Chinese are here. They are building our northern port in Haifa. They're building our northern port in Ashdod.
Who's letting them build here?
We're adding them. My first job in government, when I was the deputy, was to go to the Chinese and ask them politely for 20,000 additional laborers. I got 6, and that was considered a victory.
You have Chinese nationalists working here in Israel?
If you get up in the morning in my neighborhood right here, it looks like Shanghai. There is so many people with little yellow helmets and bicycles. They are building, we say the national bird of Tel Aviv is the crane, right? Half the cranes you see over our horizon here have Chinese signs on them. They are building our subway and keep me awake all night. That subway, you can maybe see a little later, is right across the street from us, our underground system here, built by the Chinese. Chinese build many times faster and much cheaper than any other construction workers in the world. Very quick, So there's a great economic situation. Partially because of that very high natural increase rate in Israel, we are short about 60,000 apartments per year here. And the housing prices are literally, no pun intended, through the roof. And for a 2-room apartment in Tel Aviv, you could buy a mansion in most places in the United States. And so that ability to build quickly and cheaply is a strategic economic interest. Our ports were built by the British in the 1930s for a population of less than 1 million. Now we're 10 million. And we have to import 90% of our food. So that's also a strategic interest, to build these ports very, very quickly and expand them. But there's a broader strategic geopolitical reason, and that is the Americas pulling out. America's pulling out of the Gulf areas, pulling out of the Middle East, and the Chinese are coming in. And it's very difficult to ignore this. So now I have sat through meetings with 3 administrations, Republican and Democratic alike, and they all had the same message, and that is that they are very angry with us about our relationship with China. And if the Chinese continue to build the Haifa port, the 6th Fleet will not visit Haifa anymore. How about that one? And I've heard the Prime Minister explain all the time, we're going to proceed very delicately, particularly when it comes to, advanced technologies. But there are realities here that the people who run Israel's economy and even the people who run Israel's military can't ignore. China, on one hand, has no history of anti-Semitism. We have good relations with China, certainly, and here the prime minister is going to China apparently next month. But the Chinese also back our enemies. They vote against us in the UN consistently. They have just signed a $400 billion, 25-year-long treaty with the Iranians that has a military dimension. It's oil for guns. And the Chinese are more like a frenemy. They just are for us. And there's no substitute for the United States as our ultimate ally. No one else, no other country shares our values, gives us $4 billion a year in aid, casts the veto against those resolutions that the Chinese are supporting. So we are in that type of bind here.
Tough.
It is a tough
Tough
one.
situation.
Yeah.
And it does feel like the United States is pulling out of being involved in the Middle East.
Not just the Middle East. And there's a lot of focus on China right now. But if you were to talk to an ambassador from, Japan or Korea or Germany, they maybe feel the same thing, that this is not the America we knew. I came back from Washington in 2014, and I had a tough message for Israeli policymakers, which is, we're on our own. This is not the America we knew. I was a younger paratrooper in Beirut in 1982, and we knew that, if Israel got into a real bind, that President Reagan would send the Marines and get us out. And he did, twice. Today, Israel gets in a bind. I don't think the Marines are coming so fast. We're on our own. That was good news and bad news. The good news is we're not a weak country anymore. We can stand on our own 2 feet. America will still be our ally, just not in the same way, and we can live with it. 10 years later, I think everyone understands this now. They don't have to whisper these things anymore. America's not there in the same way. 20 years ago, less than 20 years ago, 20 years ago now, right? George Bush sent 600,000 American troops into Iraq. I want to see the United States send 600 troops anywhere around the world today. The ability to project power is everything. So that creates a number of rippling effects. One is that the Saudis are going to turn to China to mediate a rapprochement with Iran. And our prime minister is going to go to China as well. And that is going to ruffle some collars, to say the least.
Yeah, it's very
on the
intense.
American side.
Very intense.
Very intense. And it's bipartisan.
Right.
And it's bipartisan.
Right.
Unusual.
Israel is such an intense place. It's intense in its history, in feelings, emotion, security. You can't help but when you're here, just feel this, immense intensity. I oftentimes describe Israel as like Marilyn Monroe.
On steroids.
On steroids, right? Like people can't, it's such a tiny place, right? And such a tiny population, but people can't stop staring at her. Yeah. Whether they love her or they hate her, they can't stop staring at her. Maybe it ties into the chosenness of,
undoubtedly.
The chosen people were chosen to make the mistakes first, or the Israelis are chosen to be the canary in the mine. How do we wrap up this conversation? What are some of the final words that you would love to share with Americans?
Well, I have two perspectives on Israel, okay? As someone who's lived here for 45 years. And then I have the perspective as a historian, which is very different. So when I came to this country, now we're talking the 1970s, we did not have peace with Jordan. We didn't have peace with Egypt. We had hostile relations with China, hostile relations with India. There was this entity known as the Soviet bloc. Remember this? Russia, 12 satellite nations, all enemy nations. Enemy nations. We had no relations with Africa. Africa cut off relations with us after the 1974 oil boycott. Very few relations with South America. And with the United States, we had a friendly relationship. We did not have a strategic alliance with the United States. There was an Arab boycott here. You couldn't get McDonald's or Pepsi. We were a healthier country back then. The food was bad. Even the falafel was bad. We were a poor agrarian country. Our major export item was oranges. Okay? Yeah. 3 million Jews were imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain. Tens and tens of thousands of Jews imprisoned basically in Ethiopia. And you scoot ahead. In my lifetime, what I saw, relations with China, relations with India, relations with the former Soviet bloc, some of our closest friends, relations with Africa. When I was the prime minister, every week I hosted some African leader. It was amazing. It was like the procession. South America, peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, peace with 4 Abraham Accord countries. With the United States, not only a strategic alliance, but probably the deepest and most multifaceted strategic alliance which the United States has had with any foreign power in the post-World War II period. The Israeli economy, we talked before, we're vying now with Germany in terms of our average GDP, world leader in innovation. All of these achievements I've witnessed. The immigration of 1 million former Soviet Jews to this country, the equivalent of the United States absorbing France, right, in a decade. The airlifting of 100,000 Ethiopian Jews, now just another 6,000 just came. I mean, if someone would have told me that this is what Israel would look like in my lifetime, when I moved to here, I would say, you're crazy. So we mentioned May 1948, we wake up and find ourselves the proud owner of a sovereign country. There are 600,000 Jews in this country, the population of Boston today, where a good chunk of them were Holocaust survivors. They were refugees from Arab countries. The army had enough bullets to fight for 1 week. That's what the army reported to Ben Gurion. We had no relations with anybody. We had no allies. We had no natural resources. And we were invaded by 6 Arab armies the day we created and fighting down the street, Jaffa. And then we turned around and created this. And what did we create? Put aside the modern economy, put aside, the water that comes out of our tap, which is better than anything you get in a bottle. That's very rare. We make a country that is one of maybe 5 countries in the world. United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. There's never known a second of non-democratic governance. Not a second. And we're the only country on that list that's never known a second of peace. And what usually destroys democracies are wars. We've never had anything close to a coup in this country, really. That is truly extraordinary. We've absorbed Jewish refugees from 70 different nations who didn't have a common culture, didn't have a common language, and we forged a nation out of this. We forged a nation. We created an armed force, which is today more than twice as big as the British and French armies combined. And in so many ways, Israel can provide a model for the key problems facing the West. We have learned to balance modernity with tradition, with democracy, with the defended democracy at arms, East and West, different religions. Israel presents a very compelling model to the West. So I think that as we face problems, some of the problems that I've mentioned in the 2048 book, whether it's being the ultra-Orthodox or the Reform or the Bedouin, it can seem insurmountable unless you have my personal historical perspective, in which case, boy, we have overcome worse than this. We actually have.
So true. Now,
there are actually culinary tours of Israel, which I think is hysterically funny because I came here, the falafel was bad. And the culinary tours, people come here to eat. It'd be crazy. And the water, I wrote an article for Commentary back in 2007 that talked about the 7 existential threats facing Israel. And some of the same existential threats we're facing today, Iran, one of them was lack of water. We had no water. We actually knew how much water we had when we were going to die. And today, Israel leads the world in water reclamation. We reclaim over 90% of our water. The country that comes after us is Spain with 20%. So we got out of an existential threat. By the way, a lot of countries that are running out of water, need only look here.
Right.
So I come at all of these problems with I hope, a clear and sober look, saying, okay, these are the problems. They are very severe. None of them are insurmountable. All of them have the solutions. With the ultra-Orthodox, give them education. With the Bedouin of the South, apply Israeli law. These are not rocket science. It's not rocket science. We compromise on reform. And with the Iranian nuclear program, we'll defend ourselves.
One often needs the perspective of a great historian, right? And so thank you so much for this conversation. Israel is a beacon of light in the Middle East. It's a great pleasure to sit with you here. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. You do with PragerU.